But yeah, I can't believe it's going to be Canada versus USA for the Four Nations face-off.
Yeah, I'm so excited, man. Like, because this time it's going to be for all the marbles. And like, are they playing it in Boston?
They are playing in Boston. I know they started off in Montreal and they're in Boston now. But I mean, Canada, they're going to have to try to rebound against US for to get that title. I don't know if it's like a trophy or bragging rights or keeping their own country at this point. But yeah, no, they brought out their best, and I know Cale Makar has been a bit of a issue on defense, not like playing wise, but with like his injuries.
Yeah.
And if he can't go for the final, I know who they should call up.
Who?
Someone named Jack Johnson.
Let's go. And welcome back, everybody, to the best music podcast on this side of the Mississippi. Actually, on all sides of the world. I need to keep riding with that trope, man.
Yeah.
This podcast is called Hey, Listen to This, and it is hosted by two dashingly good-looking men who share the same middle name. I am the one. I am the only. I am the one who does not like wind chills of 6 degrees, but recognize in Canada that there is wind chills of negative 40 degrees right now. Ryan James Kearns.
Negative 40. Good night. Oh, I can't even deal with that. Sorry, Canada, for that and also everything. I am the one, the only, I cannot wait for summer and spring to get here because I'm tired of this. Matthew James Durzik. And for those of you who don't know what we do here on Hey, Listen to This, we basically look at each other and say, hey, listen to this. Now, what does that mean? Well, what it means is every week we take a look at an album of our choice, whether it's an album that's relevant to the times or relevant to the pop charts. By the way, did you see that post I put the other day on Blue Sky?
Yeah.
That 5 albums that we reviewed are in the top 200 and Metallica was one of them?
Our influence has no bounds.
Yeah, also albums are kind of dead as a selling medium. Anyway, the point being that we just take time to dissect an album track by track or whatever it is we're going to do this week and talk about what we like, what we don't like. And at the end, we give a rating and a album based off this that we'd recommend. And before we get into this week's album, Ryan, what did we do last week?
So we went to the year of our Lord 2020, and then we checked out the album by the one, the only Yves Tumor, and that album's Heaven to a Tortured Mind. I had an interesting time reviewing that album, even in post-Glow review here, looking back on it last week, this week. I realized that, I might have been a little bit higher on that album than I needed to be, because that album was basically a lot of groove, but no real, meat behind the bones. But if I'm not mistaken, I think I gave that album an 8 out of 10, right?
Yeah, you gave that an 8 and I gave it a 7.5. So I think we both agreed that it was a good album. Not necessarily a, oh my god, you gotta listen to this album right now album, but a good album nonetheless. Yeah. So finishing off our February series of reviews, this week we are going to be taking a look at a jazz album. And this week we are talking about a jazz album from 1970 entitled Jack Johnson, or A Tribute to Jack Johnson by Miles Davis. Now, before we even get into what is a Miles Davis, which we will get there, what exactly is a Jack Johnson? And it is not the hockey defenseman I made reference to in the early intro. It is also not the guitarist who has inspired this legion of acoustic acts across the nation. No. This Jack Johnson goes all the way back to a man born in the 1870s. This dude was a bad mamma jamma. He was born in Galveston, and as he grew older, he turned into the best boxer in the world, heavyweight champion, and he was black. And that was a big thing because this was in the 1900s, the early 1900s, where being black in the Western world was still sort of not widely accepted, to put it very compromisingly.
Very gently.
Yeah, very, very gently. And so Johnson was a guy who would fight and try to make his way up to the top ranks. And there was one fight in particular. I believe the fighter's name was, I think, Justin Jeffries.
I'm not a boxing aficionado. I know the Mike Tyson and Jake Paul fight. And then, I know who, Muhammad Ali is.
Yeah.
I know Floyd Mayweather. And that's it.
No, that's fine. I was close. It was James J. Jeffries in 1910. And Johnson won that fight over Jeffries, who was white. And, there ended up being hundreds of injuries and arrests across the nation because of that fight and the reaction to it, and over 24 deaths.
Holy cow!
Yeah. And again, this was before the age of Twitter, before the age of Facebook, before the age of AOL, like way, way before that. Like this was before like television, basically. And somehow the news of Johnson winning just spread like wildfire to where the nation just sort of found itself in an uproar over it because of the racial tensions. And Johnson would continue to fight pretty much throughout the entirety of his life. He also became notorious for being a desegregationist in a personal level and on a business level as well. He ran like a nightclub that was desegregated. He also had several wives who were white, which was also in certain areas of the country not legal. And he got arrested for it, for violating the Mann Act. And instead of going to jail, he just fled the country for 2 decades before finally coming back and serving, I think it was like 2 years in prison. Died in a car crash in the 40s at the age of 64. And yeah, that is a very short synopsis of who Jack Johnson, the boxer, was.
So, thank you for doing that little, rundown of Mr. Jack Johnson, because, all that I knew about him was he's a boxer. Miles Davis made this album in tribute to him, and at the very end, he says, this is Jack Johnson, and I'm black. And we'll talk about that whenever we get to that moment of the track. But, I didn't actually take a look into, the history of who this album is based off of. I mainly just, I'll give my... We'll get to the album, soon,
we will.
Soon enough. But, I was mainly focused on the music. So.
Right. No, that's totally fair. And to be completely transparent about this isn't necessarily a tribute album to the boxer per se, although in a sense it is, but it's also a soundtrack of sorts, because there was a documentary released in 1970, same year, and they had asked Miles to do the music for it. So it's a documentary about Jack Johnson that ended up getting an Academy Award nomination for Best Documentary Film. Did not win, but this album was released as the music for it.
Okay, cool. Yeah. That's a really good, laying the groundwork, man. Excellent job.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, I figured for reasons we'll get into, I figured I'd lay that groundwork out first. And then secondly, I'll lay the groundwork on a What is a Miles Davis, which is a lot more simpler and a lot more of a... I wouldn't say less controversial, but sort of controversial. Miles Davis, legendary jazz trumpeter, started out, I believe it was in Dizzy Gillespie's band in the 40s, and then soon enough became his own artist with albums like Birth of the Cool, stuff like the legendary Kind of Blue, which is considered one of the greatest jazz albums of all time and basically broke open the doors for jazz. Worked a lot with John Coltrane in the 50s. 60s come around, he starts experimenting a little bit more. He starts going out with this core quintet of Tony Williams on drums, Ron Carter on bass. Wayne Shorter as saxophonist, Herbie Hancock on the keyboards, and himself on trumpet. And this group recorded a bunch of albums in the 60s as a unit. And then we get towards the end of the decade. And towards the end of the decade, Miles gets even more experimental. And he starts teetering with his idea of fusing jazz and rock together. And that's how you come up with albums such as In a Silent Way, and most notoriously, the double album Bitches Brew from 1969, or I think it's 1970s when it was officially released, but around that same time. And it became one of the most popular jazz albums ever, and considered to be the first major fusion album, as in the fusion of rock and jazz. So this album essentially follows that album, and here we have pretty much the same concept, but twisted a little because it's soundtrack music, but it's also not quite as... We'll get into it. There's a lot there. As far as my introduction to Miles Davis, I kind of mentioned already, sort of started with Kind of Blue, and just went from there basically, because I remember reading in the copy of the 500 Greatest Albums of All Time from Rolling Stone that I bought back in the mid-2000s when they first made the list. They've revised it twice since, but we won't get into that right now. What happened is that they put this album at number 12 on that list, like the highest jazz album, just outside the top 10.
This album we're talking about.
No. I'm Kind of Blue.
Oh, okay.
This album, I don't think has made any of those lists.
Like my brain was about to explode. I'm like,
No. No. Kind of Blue was number 12 on that list, and listened to it, loved it. Haven't listened to it in a while. Probably should get back to that. But at the same time, what happened with Miles is just he kept experimenting, and then I kept listening, and then found this album and appreciated it. So that's what we're talking about today.
So my excellent work with you laying down the framework for the album and who Miles is as a whole. Even though I don't want to sound like, for lack of a better term, somebody who is a elitist when I say this, but if you don't know who Miles Davis is, what are you doing here? Oh my god. But anyways, we do that for basically everyone. When we started this whole Black History Month DEI initiative for this month that we're currently in,
right?
We literally started with Beyonce, and who doesn't know what a Beyonce is? But anywho, my personal experience with Mr. Davis is he's somebody who I hold in a very high regard. If you were to ask me, Ryan, who do you think is one of the greatest musicians of all time? He's one of the names that comes right to my brain. Because he essentially, you kind of alluded to, he redefined the genre 5 to 7 times. He created really iconic albums that I've enjoyed. Bitches Brew, Kind of Blue, the album that you were literally just talking about, Sketches of Spain, Birth of the Cool, In a Silent Way. Needless to say, I'm a passive fan.
Right.
I own 2 of his records on vinyl, which are Kind of Blue and his Live Evil album that was released as a Record Store Day deal. But in even to go a little further in terms of my relationship with Mr. Davis here, I actually wrote a college paper on Kind of Blue. So, and when I mean I wrote a paper, I literally went to a library, checked out books, read books, and actually put those words into my paper, as compared to what most people do nowadays, which is basically just go on Wikipedia. Actually, I'm even dating myself now when I'm saying that, because they're probably they're going on to ChatGPT.
I was about to say.
Be hey, write me a paper on this. So, how do the times have changed, man?
I know.
But yeah, so long story short, he is somebody that's been on my radar, not on my radar, but somebody who I've really appreciated for a very long time, that I've always wanted to get into, like, other albums from him other than the ones that are, like, the heavy hitters that I've mentioned. So whenever you brought up this album here, a tribute to Jack Johnson, I was just like, oh, okay, let's get down, man. I can get down with some Davis.
Yeah, and it's usually always a good time listening to Miles Davis. And before we move into the album itself proper, this is going to be a bit of a different episode than we usually do, mainly because there are only 2 tracks on this album, and it's not like an EP like Sable was. No, this is a 50-minute plus album. It just so happens that the 2 songs are each over 25 minutes long. And this is not necessarily something new for jazz, because in the 1950s, there were certain artists, I could name off the top of my head, like Clifford Brown, who would basically have like long pieces that would stretch over the course of one side, put one on one side, put one on the other, and call it a day. So this is not necessarily new, but what is new is, again, the sound that Miles was going for, because this idea of fusing jazz and rock together was basically just catching on. Like, not just in a jazz itself level, like an instrumental jazz, but also with the likes of more popular bands like Chicago, Blood, Sweat, and Tears. I'll throw Tower and Power in there as well, because they were sort of in that same vein, more on the R&B side. But jazz-wise, it was still seen as a controversial move to try to infuse rock, and I'm sure there were a lot of people at the time complaining that Miles Davis was selling out, and anyone following that lead was selling out. But he didn't care for various reasons, probably involving money, ego, drugs, and just the fact that he was really talented. So, 2 tracks, 50-minute album, and I just say we get into it.
Yeah, I feel like the way that we're going to handle the conversation here is, like, we'll just bring up different points in the track that we are currently covering, and, like, when we feel like we've hit everything on the head, we'll transition.
Yeah,
so.
Yeah, I think this will be more of a free-form review of each track. So I'll start with right off and out of the gate. This does not sound like jazz. It sounds like hard rock and roll, particularly because the only instruments that are being used so far are guitar, bass, and drums. And particularly of note is the guitar by John McLaughlin, who was on Bitches Brew and slowly starting to rise the ranks among jazz guitarists. He comes in and just lays down that very hard riff. And it feels more like a riff than an actual, like, solo. He's not, like, going wiener, neener, neener on the guitar. He's just sort of laying down the foundation. And with him are the bassist Michael Henderson and the drummer, who is Billy Cobham. Cobham, who would later join McLaughlin in the Mahavishnu Orchestra later on in the decade. And I'm just going to say it right now. These two, Michael Henderson and Billy Cobham, are the keys, not just to this song, but the whole damn album. They are locked in the whole time, and they sound great. Henderson especially, like, I feel like a lot of, like, nerds, and if you are a nerd, number 1, I'm sorry, number 2, join us. But a lot of nerds would, like, hear some of the names we're throwing out there, like John McLaughlin, or later on Herbie Hancock, or Billy Cobham, and be like, oh, I think I know who that is. Like, this is the only thing I know Michael Henderson from. Like, this is, again, he's sort of an unknown in the sort of general jazz conscience or the general music conscience. And that's a shame, because this is an absolute, like, 10 out of 10 performance from him on the bass, not just to start out this track, but throughout the entirety of it. But it does start out more or less a rock piece for the first 2 minutes or so. And again, you're just sort of sitting there thinking, wait a minute, is this jazz?
So, yeah, like, my impression right out of the gate, like the opening bit with John McLaughlin basically laying out that riff and how, like, Billy and Mike came along, it kind kind of reminded me of a scene that you would see out of like Roadhouse, the movie. Remember Roadhouse, the movie?
I do. I actually only watched it for the first time last year, but yes, I do know what you mean when you say that this sounds like something out of Roadhouse.
Now, like, for those of you who are like, what is a Roadhouse? Well, we're not going to dive into that. But, like, just picture, like, this old school rock bar kind of feel. Like, they're just really just essentially jamming. And from what I was able to research on my end, basically, like, this track here right off, like, it's just essentially a jam session. Like, everything is basically stream of consciousness. And with, I would say maybe the middle part, which we will get to, like, there's going to be a transition point where it's clearly a little bit of an overdub. But I have a theory why that overdub existed in the first place based on what I was able to find out. But, yeah, I'm right there with you. Mike Henderson, oh my goodness. Like, especially in the next track, we'll get to it. Mm-hmm. But, like, he was one of the MVPs of the album that I picked up right away. I really like what he's doing. I wasn't really sold on Billy's drum work quite as much as you. But I'm not saying, like, he was doing anything bad or anything like that. He's pretty locked in. But, like, it wasn't, like, comparing him to, like, Mike Henderson and even, like, John McLaughlin, who, like, I really like the work that he's laying down here. Like, it just seems like he's doing his job, like, basically supplying a solid foundation, but not doing anything that's, like, kind of, like, making himself seem a little bit different. I do like his work in the next track, which we will get to, but, yeah, like, at least kicking everything off, like, right off, it... Like you said, it doesn't really sound like anything like jazz. It mainly just sounds like an old school bar blues rock song, like a jam session. And that only lasts for a little bit, because like after that little opening, you get into like more of a quiet section that the track transitions into, and then everybody. Miles Davis.
Yeah.
Appears.
And before we get into Miles himself, that transition that you're speaking of, I thought that transition was quite flawless and quite jazzy, because basically Cobham drops out, so it's just mostly Henderson with a little bit of McLaughlin in there.
Yeah.
And it still like feels a little locked in, but at the same time it does feel a little loose, like they're trying to make it sound like a transition, and I think it's pretty much flawless. Like, they just nailed that. Changing keys, changing personnel, and sort of switching things around on the fly in order to introduce Miles to this piece. And then Miles does come in with his trumpet. Now, again, one of the things that makes this whole album and the whole fusion experience sound different is the fact that, unlike older jazz where you had a sort of a melody line and then the solos would come through, here there's really not a melody line at all. Like, they're just playing, they're just jamming, and here Miles is doing exactly that. Like, he's not trying to make it seem like he's trying to paint this pretty picture of, what a trumpet sounds like and making it sound pretty. No, he's trying to make this sound like an electric guitar. He is trying to make his trumpet a rock instrument. And he succeeds, because the way he's wailing and doing the little flutters that just are like right up on the mic and just screaming into it, he succeeds. And not only that, to drive this point home, he basically gets into a trade-off session with John McLaughlin, where he's playing and then McLaughlin's playing, and they're basically just like two guitars up there, except one of the guitars is a trumpet. I'm on a horse. I don't know why I brought that reference up, but all right, we're going with it. But yeah, like Miles, like it's not like the most, again, striking melody to hit your ears, especially if you're more accustomed to traditional jazz. But if you take away that sort of predisposition to what jazz is supposed to sound like and just listen to what he's trying to do, it's successful and it sounds really good. And again, they're doing this while everyone in the back is just, again, keeping everything locked in.
So one thing that came to mind, like, awesome job pointing out the point and counterpoint that Davis and McLaughlin were doing there. That was a highlight for me. Like, whenever you drew the comparison of Miles using his trumpet as a guitar, like, I wish you could have seen inside my brain, because it was like a nuclear explosion that came off. Like, I was just like, oh my goodness, like, everything is like you unlock a new appreciation for this track for me, man. And like, even Davis as a whole, like, one thing I want to bring up here is you brought up, you introduced like the concept of like there is no melody line, it's just jamming. When we did the Sly and the Family Stone review a couple of reviews ago, we talked about the concept of like musical conversations. Like, this is basically that. Like, there's no end to it. There's no like, direct meaning other than we are just vibing. We are just playing off of one another. They're interconnected in their music, the way that they're delivering it, and it's a beautiful thing, man. And like, even going into like how Miles is soloing as a whole, like, I like how he's utilizing his instrument. One thing that always has driven me to, like, Miles Davis as a trumpet player and as a jazz player, as a musician, he's not more known for showing off his technical skill, but that's on purpose. He almost has like a minimal approach when it comes to like his soloing, as compared to like a John Coltrane where he's just trying to hit all the notes. Like, Davis utilizes space to a T. Everything he does is for a purpose. And like here, like, at least coming out of the gate, like, you get like, little pops here or there. And then whenever he like hits those high notes, like, they sound just so good. And then whenever he comes riding back down, like, it's music to my ears. Like, I absolutely love the way he's utilizing it and how he's sounding. And just even outside of like those moments, like when he's utilizing the flutter tongue, and everyone he's like hitting rapid licks, they're a great touch. Like, I'm just loving how Davis is coming out the gate, man.
I do too. And on top of that, you mentioned how a lot of the times, especially around this period of Miles Davis, there wasn't like a whole lot of him trying to be like outward with his solos. Like, he basically just made it so, because as it was since early stages of Birth of the Cool, definitely with Kind of Blue, it felt like he was pushing more towards the compositional nature of his pieces. Like, he wanted more focus on that than on his playing, which is, again, revolutionary for jazz in a sense, and revolutionary for fusion, because no one had done this before. So Miles is going along, and it's going great. And then things change a little bit, because we get into what I'd like to call the first of several dream sequences in this album, where whatever is on record and whatever everybody's doing just sort of fades away. And you get into this sort of weird dream sequence that doesn't feature really anything but maybe a little bit of keyboard, a little bit of bass, and mostly trumpet with reverb. And while I do think that it does stop the momentum of the good thing that they had going a little bit, at the same time, it does sound good.
So that moment that you're literally talking about right now, like, that is the only moment I can think of that it almost seems like it's an overdub, where, like, it doesn't naturally occur. And like, even how the band shifts out of that, you can tell, like, oh hey, like, they were told, like, oh hey, just start jamming out, and they brought it back in. Like, it's a good moment. My theory about why this moment occurred, again, I could be extremely off when I say this, but the information I was able to dig up, it seems like Herbie Hancock wasn't originally planned to be on this track here. apparently he was just passing through in the building, and they essentially grabbed him and they threw him on a Hammond organ. So, the dream sequence we're hearing right now is probably like when he got on the Hammond organ. So, but I could be off when I say that. So,
you know what? I like that theory. Yeah. I like it. Because instead of, keeping everything jamming and all of a sudden hearing, like, the click of an on switch and him warming up or whatever the case is, maybe they just said, hey, we'll just throw in a dream sequence in there, too. Another theory that I could throw out there, and again, this is sort of massive speculation, but particularly when it comes to the crazy life of Jack Johnson, or more honestly, the crazy life of Miles Davis at that point, because, drugs, 70s, music, that might have been sort of a weird sort of self-referential thing, like, hey, I'm sort of going into this, slipping into this mode, kind of like in the last part of Goodfellas where... Spoilers, thank you.
No, you can go ahead.
Whenever Henry Hill is trying to deal with, being a parent and also dealing drugs and trying to get away from police, but he's also doing drugs. And there's that scene where it's cutting between Jump Into the Fire by Nilsson and Manish Boy by Muddy Waters as soon as he takes that hit. That's kind of what this reminded me of. Like, this is Miles, or maybe the listener in a sense, taking that hit, sort of that whoosh into another space of time before fading back into reality. That's, again, massive speculation on my part, but it's our podcast. Who the hell cares? So as we get out of the dream sequence back into the groove track, the main track that is right off, introducing Steve Grossman on soprano sax. And I gotta say, like, thinking about it now, soprano sax is an interesting choice for a rock song, because I'll say this, I like Grossman's solo, but it doesn't feel like it super fits. Like, I'm not gonna knock points off of it for anything, but it does feel like a lot smoother and a lot more, this is a jazz solo than that, which may have been the point, to sort of, be sort of the jazz presence in this rock setting, but at the same time, because it's as subdued as it is and as professional and smooth as it is, it doesn't quite gel with the sort of rough rock and roll that Miles is going for, and the rhythm section is perfecting to a T. Not saying it's a bad solo by any means, but it is what it is.
So my theory about that is maybe Steve Grossman, like, again, this is the first time I've ever hearing of this gentleman in terms of like a musical setting, but apparently he might have just only had the mindset of a jazz musician, unlike a Davis, unlike, John McLaughlin, like in the rhythm section that we've mentioned. Like, maybe he only can bring that to the table, which, it's fine. It's, like, not my least favorite part of the track. There is a least favorite part of the track coming up here that I will talk about. But, like, there wasn't really any moments that I can really pinpoint in Grossman's solo that I'm like, oh, hey, yeah, I really like that. It's just pretty much a standard, like, sax solo. Like, no slam against Kenny G, but, like, I appreciated what Grossman brought to the table as compared to anything Kenny G has ever laid down to record.
We'll save Kenny G for another time. Another theory, and this I won't even say this is a theory. This is just a fact, because we've played jazz before, not in a combo setting like this, but realistically, if it doesn't take any sort of genius to realize, hey, if you're going to play a track that's going to take up the entire side of a vinyl record, maybe you should have more than one soloist. And I'm sure that if it was, you take someone like Grossman out of the equation, all of a sudden that's more work for the likes of McLaughlin, Miles, Herbie Hancock. And not necessarily something you would want to do, because that just becomes exhausting, and who knows, maybe Columbia would get pissed. But alas, none of that has to be worried about here, because Grossman comes in with his solo, it sounds good, and then it gets to Herbie Hancock time. And this part is just unreal. First of all, it's sort of, he just sort of comes in, fiddles around the keyboards a little bit. Then the rhythm section pulls back. Cobb, particularly, the drums like pop out. And it's mostly just, McLaughlin doing the wah-wah thing with his guitar. Henderson still just playing on and doing a great job. And slowly but surely, Hancock just sort of, noodles a little bit. Then he hits that one weird, like, off-kilter chord that he crescendos on. And then Cobb comes back in and it just rams into this part where Hancock just plays this organ riff of da-da-da. And then Miles comes back in and sort of fills in the holes that are left by the riff. And honestly, I love that part. I really do. And I can see in your eyes that we're probably about to fight. I don't know what it is. Like, to me, this part just feels like very, like, angsty, like, very rock and roll in its own sense. And I know Herbie's not doing a whole lot in that regard, but it just sounds very, like, panicky, funky, and just in your face. Like, again, this is supposed to be a quote-unquote jazz album, and for Miles or Herbie to, like, put this down on an album and just, like, throw it in everyone's face, like, I was just kind of taken away by it. Just, like, how mesmerizing it is.
So, my beef, because you were able to read my eyes, I don't have a really good poker face around.
Yeah, no, I saw the...
So, yeah, my beef is with Herbie Hancock as a whole. Like, the rest of the band, they're doing a great job. I do like how, you mentioned how, like, everything was set up where, like, everything started to strip away. You only get Mikey Henderson and Grossman just jamming, and then, like, the rest of the band comes in, like John McLaughlin and Billy Cobham, like we mentioned. But, like, my main beef is, like, I didn't like what Herbie was bringing to the table because I thought it was a bit robotic in nature, and like he kept landing on that one chord that you mentioned. It was like very panicky and like very like disorienting, not disorienting, but like it was very prominent. And then it keeps hammering on that chord, and it overpowered the rest of the group as long as he kept hitting that chord. And like for me, it just took away from the listening experience.
I'm going to disagree with you on that. I don't think it took away from it. I kind of understand where you're coming from because while Herbie's playing those notes, it does feel like he's like sort of angrily like being like, I'm here too. But at the same time, again, considering that I think this is meant to be his solo section and he's just sort of taking it in a different direction, I understand why that's not your cup of tea, and I respect that. But for me, I was just like, yes, more of this, please.
We also got to consider that apparently Herbie was just, passing through in the building, and then he got yanked into this jam.
Right.
So, like, he wasn't really prepared for anything.
No, and so he just sort of walks in and plays some notes, and I'm sure, because here's my other thought about this. If it had sucked, if Miles had thought you're not trying hard enough, they probably would have done a retake. But he said, no, you know what? We're going for a rock thing here. I think this rocks. Let's put it on the record.
So after the Herbie solo ends, and like not even like just a solo, but like after like the chords stop like grating my eardrums, like around the 18-minute mark, we get like another sonic shift, and we get John McLaughlin doing a guitar line that almost feels like a bass line that I really like, and like. Also, to counteract that, that's echoed by Mike actually doing that same line. So I really like that songwriting choice. It wasn't even really a songwriting choice. It was just a musical conversation choice. They were just connecting on that. That was really good. And then you get John just starting a line and Mike is finishing it like a point counterpoint. We get Steve Grossman taking another lead part on the soprano sax here towards the end. I really like I really like the work that John McLaughlin's doing here as a whole in this track, but even at this part, like, he's doing a lot of great stuff, and I find myself actually, there's two players that I constantly get drawn to when I'm listening to this track, and that's John McLaughlin and Mikey Henderson. Like, they're both doing really fantastic stuff if you actually lean in and listen in.
Yeah, and I know we don't agree on Cobham, because I think he's more or less just keeping the tempo and putting in his flares whenever necessary. But I think he does a great job on this too. Again, the rhythm section throughout this entire track, and again, spoilers, this entire album, is the highlight of it, because it just lays the groundwork so broadly. I will say the transition back to that part you mentioned of sort of the straight piece, where it goes from the swing to the straight notes that Henderson and McLaughlin were trading off of. I wish they would have done that a little bit smoother, but not to the point where I'm like, oh, this is horrible. I'm just like, you know. And then again, it just sort of continues on to the point where, I don't know, do you have any other notes for like the ending parts of this song?
Other than, it just seems like it's like a loose jam session, and McLaughlin's taking the lead, and Herbie's just joining in to love everything out.
And my final note is that the balls of this track, after nearly a half hour of music, to have a fade out.
Like, there's no definitive conclusion. Like, what
no,
dude?
like almost like the engineer just said screw it and left. Just like, we're done here. It's been 27 minutes. If you guys want to keep going, that's fine. But for contractual purposes, we need to stop this.
So before we move on to Yesternow, I got a couple questions for you. One, did you mark if you liked one of these tracks better than the other?
I did.
Okay.
I did. And easily it's this track. Right Off is my favorite track off this album.
Okay. I actually like Yesternow a little bit more, but they're both in equal footing for me in terms of overall rating.
Okay.
But when we get to Yesternow, I'll explain why. But yeah.
And I don't have a bottom. It's
yeah, no.
It's stupid.
Yeah. While we both had maybe some nitpicks about Right Off, it was an excellent track
Absolutely
to start off this album. So the other question that I have, because we're officially in the halfway point of the review.
We are.
So, is that if the listener out there is really appreciating what we're putting down to the table and introducing them to albums such as this that they might not be aware of, what is one way that they can help support us to make sure that we keep on keeping on here?
Well, one thing that they can do is call their local congressman to prevent this grand takeover of a tyrannical government. But if they don't feel like doing that, the easiest way they can help us out is by going on our social media feeds, whether it be Blue Sky or Facebook or Threads or Instagram, following us there for latest updates on things we got going on. Also, go to our YouTube page. That's where we upload our episodes every week in a video format, if you like having YouTube on in the background, wherever it is, or in the foreground. If you just want to sit there and listen to us without any sort of motion, that's fine too. Also, we're on Spotify, Apple Music, what other...
wherever you can listen to a podcast, that's where we have it. My podcasting platform of choice nowadays is Pocket Cast, and we're on there too. So.
Oh, okay. Yeah. I have never even heard of them until just now. So I appreciate you bringing them up. Go Pocket Cast. And if you like what you hear, particularly on YouTube, give us a like, comment, subscribe. If you like hearing us anywhere else, pin it to your social media, say, hey, check these guys out, they're doing a great job. If you want to tell us that directly, and if you don't know who we are directly and can't send us a private message personally, which is understandable, we have an email, which is ttalisten@gmail.com, and ttalisten is our sort of moniker / username across all platforms. Also, if you have any suggestions for future episodes, we'd love to hear them as well. And for those of you who are new or have been following on this whole time, again, thank you. We appreciate this, and we appreciate you for listening.
So, moving into Yesternow, dude. what a whiplash. Like,
yeah.
So we talk about, like, you know, how Mikey Henderson did an excellent job in the previous track. Here, it's absolutely hypnotic what he's laying down. Like, the way that I actually, you know, listened to the album and, like, you know, made notes and everything like that, I, like, a couple of days ago, I literally came home from work and made dinner, checked out the, like, put on headphones and just jammed out to the record. And, like, when I got to Yesternow, like how he was laying it down and how everything was, like, completely minimal, I was hypnotized. Like, I was completely engaged with this 100%, and just the bass line that he's laying down here, it's so good. And I love how John McLaughlin is actually adding stingers at the end of it, just, like, you know, capping off that, like, completing the thought. Great execution there. And, like, at least for the first little bit here, like, you get, like, Billy Cobham coming in, adding, like, you know, another layer to the song, but not doing anything, like, you know, extraordinary, just, like, you know, being very purposeful with his selection of what he's actually adding to the track. Before that, Miles comes in and adds such a light touch, but it's great, man. And this is where Miles is really good at with, like, you know, executing compositions and just, like, you know, really digging into, like, what he wants to get out of music. And it's so minimal, but I really like what he's bringing to the table. And just everything is so well grounded by Mikey Henderson. I cannot say that name enough. Like, at least coming out of the gate. And yeah, just right out of the gate, man, like, I'm completely sold on this track.
It took me a few tries to get there because it didn't have quite the same flash as Right Off did. But at the same time, there's nothing wrong with it. I mean, Henderson's bass does sound great, and once again, he is the key to keeping everything in tone and in pace. Because at the beginning, it is just him and McLaughlin. It's a very ominous opening. It just sort of lays the groundwork without really laying any groundwork. Again, it's just bass and guitar. And once Miles does come in, it is softer than it was before. He's not trying to make it sound like an electric guitar as much, but he is going for a more jazz type thing. Like, if the first track was rock, this is more on the lines of R&B and funk. Like, he's not trying to necessarily, again, go for the smooth, jazzy melodies, but you talk about him listening to what's around him and sort of playing what he feels. Like, that's just Miles going to the point where, you know, he's listening to what's around him and just thinking, okay, I'll go here, play this, wait a little bit, now play this. And he's just really, like, again, because he knows the composition and he knows, like, how it sounds, like, it basically gives him free reign to do what he wants and paint the picture of what he wants to paint on this track. And he does so very, very well. Even to the point where when Billy Cobham comes in a little later on, about maybe 4 or 5 minutes in, it still feels like a loose jam session, even though it feels like more of a focused track because of the drums entering the picture. It still sounds very much like an R&B funk track that Miles wants it to be. And yeah, so far everything does sound great, as you mentioned.
And, like, to even just cap off the discussion of, like, you know, like, at least the opening of the track, one thing that I just really noticed, it just seemed like, you know, the band was really in sync with each other. Like, you know, if there was a moment of open space, like, a band came in and just filled it in, and then they got out of the way. And, like, another band member came in and they got out of the way. Like, everything is just so locked in into, it's almost like a spiritual experience for me. Like, you know, it just seems like they're connecting on that kind of level. around the 6-minute 47 mark, I love the line that Miles does where he goes in high and just rides notes on the way down. The way that he does that throughout the whole album, it's really good. It's really effective. I like what's happening there. And then around the 8-minute mark, John takes the lead part and he picks up where Miles just left off, executing, just such a great solo. And then really more marks about how that bass line just really gets stuck in your head. It's absolutely impressive that Henderson was able to ride at for a good majority of the track so far, and it just acts as such a good grounding moment. And then around the 11-minute mark, you get a sonic shift with Steve Grossman coming in on the soprano sax and Billy establishing more of a traditional, beat as compared to what the freeform nature, what we've been hearing so far is.
Yeah, and right before that, Herbie Hancock does show up rather quietly and just sort of, almost gives a musical version of a "Hey guys, I'm here" type of thing on the keyboard. But you do mention Steve Gross about 11 minutes in. Does come in with his solo, and this sounds like the first part of the track that sounds more like a traditional full band effort, because like you say, Cobham's locked in, Henderson's locked in, McLaughlin's locked in, and Grossman, again, sounds quite good here. I would say even better on this than he did on Right Off. I think it's just the territory, because here while, again, it's not meant to be like a smooth jazz track or a traditional jazz track, it feels more rooted in smooth R&B or funk or funk light, if you will, compared, again, to the rock. Because you imagine any rock band then or now introducing a soprano sax and try to get away with it? No offense, because I know I'm talking to a saxophonist, but...
I feel last week Eve Stoomer had a clarinet in one of their songs, so
Yeah, but that's a clarinet. The thing with, and I don't mean that derogatorily, but what I mean is it feels like a clarinet, it's sort of seen as this sort of weird instrument that sort of plays a role of acting sort of almost like an indie type of vibe in a sense. The Stones used to have recorders, and the Who played with recorders a couple times. The Beatles had their flutes and their orchestras at the time. But a soprano sax is a very and granted, I will say, the idea of a soprano sax being anything other than a smooth jazz instrument is kind of revisionist history. Thank you, Mr. Kenny G. And a little credit to David Sanborn as well. But the point being is that even in this context, pre-Kenny G, pre the smooth jazz uprising of the late 80s, early 90s, it still sounds better in the context of Yesternow than it does Right Off. That's the main point I was trying to make.
I can support that, man. So... after that Grossman solo that occurs and Billy shifting us to a more traditional beat, we get a dreamy sequence again that kind of comes out of nowhere, which with the context that you gave about how this is basically supposed to be the music for the documentary that that you talked about at the beginning of the review. It kind of gives a little bit more context to that maybe after hearing that, if I go back to the track, I might have a little bit more of appreciation for that. But then the following section after that is decent. It's led by a guitar part doing a bouncy line. I really like what John's doing here around the 14-minute mark. I love the licks where he just seems like he's just writing notes and just writing the vibes. It's a really good moment. And then around that mark, we get another shift in the Mikey Henderson line where it's not the very established grounding here. It's actually a higher part, and it is equally hypnotic for me.
So going back to everything you were talking about one piece at a time, first of all, the dream sequence, I think it does carry that load of it being what it is. And I do think it sounds a bit more structured this time than it did the first time. Like the first time it just sounds like a weird, hazy dream sequence. But here you have a little bit more of a rhythm to it as opposed to the first time on Right Off. Here you have a bit of more of a bass line, more of a full band effort. And then you get back into the part with McLaughlin, which I think is probably the closest he's gone to a solo on this record so far. And it doesn't feel like even it's a full, like, actual solo. Again, revisionist history as far as what a rock guitar solo is supposed to sound like. But here, like you say, he's going with the vibes. He's definitely, like, putting himself out there, but he's not, like, trying to overpower anybody. Like, Miles has this sort of motif that he's playing, the same notes over and over again, this riff that he's got going, sort of like Herbie did on Right Off. But here McLaughlin is sort of filling in those holes with his soloing or riffing or whatever you want to call it. And it does sound disjointed, but in a very wonderful, chaotic way. And then after that, it feels like he's starting to battle, in a sense, have a musical conversation with Herbie Hancock, where McLaughlin's doing one thing and then Herbie responds and McLaughlin punches back. And again, it just sounds gleefully disjointed and chaotic. And the fact that they could do it is because the rhythm section is so locked in as it is. And I know, like, I praised Herbie Hancock on the first track, and I'm going to do it again here, but it's for a much different reason. Here he is just, like, doing some unreal shit with the keyboard. Like, he is doing things, like, you're just listening to, like, wait, what is he doing? Like, he's just running up and down the keys with, like, no, like, real, like, smoothness, but it, for some reason, it just works. Like, it just sounds like the perfect, like, response to not just music, but anything. Just sort of in a sense, for lack of a better term.
So, yeah, I think as a whole, like, at least, like, for the back half of Yesternow, I was mainly just locked into, like, the whole ability of the band to, like, really just come together as, like, a one musical body. Again, for some reason, my brain just got fixated on that Mikey Henderson bass line, even on the second half. Like, it just became, like, I was, like, in a trance whenever I was listening to this here. Upon further reflection, Herbie was killing it on the back half of the track here. Really solid part. It's just, like, I just love just the ability for, like, jazz as a whole and music as a whole to, like, come together like this, where everything, there's not a point, but the point is to just connect and just, like, riff off of one another. And one could say, like, oh, hey, this sounds like, maybe, like, there's, like, some elements of, like, freeform jazz here that ultimately, like, you may associate with, like, albums and tracks that don't sound nearly as good as this piece of, like, music here, like, Bitches Brew, or, like, Ascent by John Coltrane. But, like, I really like what the group's laying together here as a whole.
Yeah, again, and then this is, like you said, mainly the part of the back half of the track after the dream sequence in the middle. It's just mostly McLaughlin and Hancock doing their own thing. Miles is in there a little bit too, and everyone just remains doing what they're doing. McLaughlin and Hancock are doing their solo parts. Henderson and Comer are locked in, and Miles is just interjecting if he even does. I don't think I heard a trumpet in the last 10 minutes of this piece until the final 90 seconds of this track, which definitely feels like the end credits of not just the documentary, even though I haven't seen it, and this album kind of makes me want to watch it, but definitely this album, because it carries a much darker tone than the previous dream sequences, because I think it's in a different key. It's in a much more of a darker key that feels very rising from the ashes type of vibe, and as that's going on, it feels like the bass and the keyboards are the only other pieces to this dream sequence. And at the very end, you get the only vocals on this entire 52-minute track, which is read by Brock Peters. And the quote is, and I think I got the full one down here, which is, "I'm Jack Johnson, heavyweight champion of the world. I'm black. They'll never let me forget it. I'm black, all right. I'll never let them forget it." And that's how the album ends. And it's a great statement for a couple of reasons. Number one, it's a strong way to represent the sort of FU attitude of Jack Johnson, the boxer. But in a sense, it's also a way to express what this album was. Because in a sense, it's very much black music. Like, it's not any type of music, whether it be rock or jazz or R&B or whatever it is. But Miles was just being unapologetically Miles. And he just decided, hey, this is what I want the record to sound like. We're going to go in the studio. We're going to cut this damn thing. And that's what this soundtrack's going to be. That's what this album's going to be. And he did it.
Yeah, he did it, man. I almost want to transition to our outro because, like, that's almost like a organic way to get into.
I know.
But, like,
you're free to have your thoughts too.
It's very like that's an easy transition point, man. Oh man. Anyways, walking away from that ledge. No, like. One thing that I'm just gonna say as a whole, like, I can't really add too much more to the end of the track and the end of the album that you already haven't added. It's a really interesting moment, and even given the full context of who Jack Johnson was, and like how we've laid down the context in this whole review, like it buttons everything up to like like a very nice end. And like one thing that I'm just gonna say as a whole, like it's been an absolute pleasure, like, going through, like, all these different artists for this month here, whether it's, like, Beyonce, Sly and the Family Stone, East Tumor, and, like, ultimately ending our Black History Month DEI initiative. I know I was kind of joking about that.
Right.
But, like, with Miles Davis, somebody who I held in high regard in terms of like his ability to like just be a musician, like it's an absolute like pleasure seeing like just what people that have gone through and like that are African American and what they can actually create out of it. It's absolutely amazing, man. I love the end of the album. I love just the overall experience that I had of the album.
I do too. And again, it's music of all different shades in a sense, because it's not, again, even though this is a album that we talked about during Black History Month. I mean, there have been sort of integration during the 4 albums that we talked about. Sly and the Family Stone had a white drummer and a white horn player. Beyonce worked with the likes of Jack White, and I'm trying to think who else was on that album.
Like Father John Misty, helped collaborate, and like Ezra Cohen from Vampire Weekend. So like there's white collaborators with there.
Correct. Yeah. And even here, John McLaughlin was a white guitarist who would go on to continue working with different artists of different colors throughout the course of the decade and his entire career. Yeah. But yeah, no, this album ends very strongly, very poignantly, and I think now we can finally say those words.
We did it, man.
We did it. We listened to Miles Davis pay tribute to Jack Johnson, and it was quite the experience. And I'm going to have you go first with your full review.
So this album was a really good time for me to really dive into it. It's actually actively encouraged me to look into more of Davis's I don't want to say lesser known albums, but albums that I'm not familiar with. Like like I said, like I'm a decent fan of jazz music and of Davis of himself, and I'm so glad I can add this album into my rotation whenever I'm checking out Mr. Davis. Like, oftentimes whenever we walk away from reviews, like I've listened to the album enough that I'm like, okay, it's gonna be a minute before I go back to it. But this is one that's gonna definitely be in rotation whenever I'm actually looking for jazz and even specifically Davis. The work by the band, like John McLaughlin killing it with, like, in Right Off, and like his ability to, like, just not just lay down chords, but really just act as like a counterpoint to Miles Davis in plenty enough tracks, and his ability to trade off of Mikey Henderson is phenomenal. Mikey Henderson, like, I don't know what else I can say about him. Like, I'm in love with whatever he's doing on this album. Miles Davis, he orchestrated this whole thing. He executed what he wanted to do to a T, and it shows. Steve Grossman, like, I know we had, like, moments where we were like, he's kind of like a little bit of an odd duck here, but he does a well enough job on his own. Herbie Hancock, random squealing, like, chords aside. Other moments he was really good. In Billy Cobham, I really haven't really shouted out his work too much other than in Yesternow, but he was really solid overall. The best moments, like I mentioned countless amount of times in this review, is just when the band's seeming like they're having musical conversations. They're really connecting on a spiritual level, and really in pockets. There are some moments, of, like I mentioned, that are just a bit sloppy in execution, but overall, though, I'm walking away from this review feeling really good about the album, really liking it. I actually upped my score a little bit in mid-review here. Well, not mid-review, but like early when I was looking into the album, but I digress. I'm going to give this album a beefy 9 out of 10.
9 out of 10. Okay. My thoughts on this album is that it's just not a great jazz album. It is a great fusion album. Again, it feels like when you listen to something like In a Silent Way, for example, like there's elements where you're like, okay, there's something there. Like they're working on something. They're getting to somewhere. You listen to Bitches Brew, revolutionary in its own right, and you're thinking, okay, they're getting somewhere, but they haven't quite gotten there yet. They haven't quite reached that pinnacle of a jazz rock fusion sound. To me, this is that album. This is, to me, the best jazz fusion album that there has ever been. And you hear it in the guitars, you hear it in the bass. Again, I agree with you. Mikey Henderson, he's basically becoming the new Russ Kunkel for you, which I appreciate that. For those of you who don't get that reference, go in our back catalog. You'll have a good time. And the fact of the matter is, again, Miles, once again, peaks as a composer more so than a soloist. And even when he solos, like I mentioned on Right Off, when he's trying to make his trumpet sound like an electric guitar, that in itself is just such a revolutionary act. The band sounds great throughout. The dream sequences, as weird as they are, do provide some sort of, break, if nothing else, to break up the monotony, which is, again, just a shrewd but successful move. And whether or not this portrays the boxer Jack Johnson in the correct light is up for debate, because not only was Jack Johnson a controversial dude in his own right, he was kind of not necessarily the greatest guy ever. I mean, he was a male before the era of sympathy, an era which we may not even yet reach, but again, another discussion for another day. But I don't care. This album is great, and despite my reservations, I'm going to go all the way and give this one a 10 out of 10.
We got a 10, ladies and gentlemen. We did it, man.
I was going to say, I think this is my first 10 since Zappa.
That's a possibility.
Yeah. I mean, I have the records. I'm just not looking at them right now.
We'll do that post episode here.
Yeah.
So fantastic record, man.
Fantastic. And Our combined scores, your 9 and my 10, reaches us to a 9.5 out of 10.
That is really impressive, man. It's short of being a 10 out of 10. I'm curious to see if we have like a 9.75 in there somewhere.
I don't think we do, because that would require one of us to give it a 9.5 and the other of us to give it a 10. And I don't think we've had that conversation yet, and I don't think we're ever going to, but you never know. The point being, 9.5 out of 10 average for this album, and I'll go with my recommendation based off of this album. There are many options, not just in the jazz world, but also in the regards of rock and soul. I could, once for the second straight week, I could recommend There's a Ride Going On, just for its musical conversation nature. I could recommend Miles's next major album, which is On the Corner, which he goes further into funk. I could even go into something like the Tony Williams Lifetime's Emergency, which is considered the first fusion album of all time, and some consider it better than Bitches Brew. But I'm not going to do any of those. I'm going to keep it simple, and I'm going to go with another similar Miles project from a few years earlier. I think just 1 year earlier, now I think about it, which is In a Silent Way, because that is where this all started. And not only that, it felt like a lot of the dream sequences on this particular album felt like a harken back to In a Silent Way directly. So if you're curious as to what that feels like, go check out In a Silent Way.
Excellent recommendation, man. So my recommendation, I could have went with another Miles project, but I decided to go with a contemporary, maybe not a contemporary, but the record that I'm going to go with is The Shape of Jazz to Come by Ornette Coleman. And the reason why I chose that is it's flexing what jazz was and what Ornette was trying to push it to at the time. So it was one of the first precursors of jazz changing from traditional bebop to experimenting and doing different stuff, and really what we talked about in this review a lot is the ability for the band to have musical conversations. That album has plenty enough moments. Excellent record. Ultimately, my recommendation, I could have went with another Miles project, but I'm glad I went with the Shape of Jazz to Come by Ornette Coleman.
So, ladies and gentlemen, if you have not listened to either The Shape of Jazz to Come by Ornette Coleman or In a Silent Way by Miles Davis, we highly recommend you doing so based off of a tribute to Jack Johnson. So with that all said, Ryan, we have one final piece of business, and just to let everybody know, we are switching up our initiatives for the month of March since our February episodes have come to a close. Ryan, what do we have lined up now?
So we are going to be shifting, March is a Women's History Month, so we are going to be shifting into music that, primarily features women. Yes. Hey, everybody.
Yes, and before you ask, yes, we did blow our blue chance early, but still, that's beside the point.
So, yeah, for me, at least coming out of the gate, because there's 5 Saturdays in March, and I'm going to get 3 reviews in this that I just realized. I want to do 2 select, I'm gonna put up 2 albums for pre-2000s, and then 2 albums that were post-2000s. But that's gonna be 2 different selections. Okay. So for the first selection, we are gonna be doing albums that are pre-2000s. So you're changing up my little my.
Yeah, you're going older for a change.
I know. Look at me. I'm changing, man. So the albums that are up for contention right now, one was released in 1994. The other one was released in 1995. I'm not going to have you pick on the year.
Okay.
I'm going to have you pick on the record label that released these albums.
Ooh, okay.
So, I know, kind of a little weird, right?
A little bit.
So, the record labels are Rhino Records or Universal Records.
Oh, jeez.
Do you know what the Rhino Records record could be?
Honestly, no.
Because you kind of made a face.
Well, it's just weird because to me, Rhino Records is mostly known for like compilations of like older music. So I'm kind of wondering what original artist they put out on the tape. You know what? That just made my argument for me. I'm going with Rhino Records.
All right, so I'm gonna fact check myself, but because you kind of made me doubt who I was for a second.
Sorry about that.
No, it's okay. Okay, so I don't know where I got this information, but apparently Rhino Records did not release this album. So, we're gonna roll with it anyway, okay?
Okay.
Because the actual record label that released it was Maverick. So.
Oh, okay.
But yeah, I'm gonna humble myself. This is a grassroots podcast. And we make mistakes, man.
We do make mistakes.
Sometimes we don't.
No better way than to kick off Women's History Month by a man making a mistake.
The album that we are going to be covering, kicking off Women's History Month, is an album, like I mentioned, that was released in 1995. It's a little album. It's a little album. It's a jagged little album.
Oh, hell yeah.
It's the album called Jagged Little Pill by one Alanis Morissette.
Let's go!
So, ladies and gentlemen, if you have not listened to Jagged Little Pill by Alanis Morissette, make sure you check out that album before next week's review, because that way you can have opinions about the opinions that me and Matt are bringing to the table.
Absolutely, and yeah, what an episode this was. It was a challenging episode.
Yeah. I felt like the conversations were really good though, so we did a very good job.
Yeah, no, this was a great episode, and if we ever somehow lose track of time, I'll never let us forget it.